entitled Diplomacy in the Arts in the Age of the Anthropocene. Diplomacy in the arts is a growing and dynamic field in diplomatic studies that not only includes museum diplomacy, but also engages the diplomatic agency of artists and state-sponsored, non-state actor and grassroots diplomatic efforts. Such diplomatic work privileges the role of art to communicate, builds bridges, and creates community. Our panelists for this session include an art historian, a political scientist, and a community organizer who uses the culinary arts to break down barriers between different communities. Following the three presentations of our speakers, questions will be posed to our panelists, which have been submitted by our audience members via the Q&A portal, which you can find at the bottom right-hand of your screen. Please submit your questions as they occur to you so that we can pose them to our panelists. And now let us turn to our speakers. Our first speaker is Jessica L. Horton, who is an associate professor of art history at the University of Delaware. Her research emphasizes the centrality of Native North American art, culture, and politics to a global story of modernity, and is supported by the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the Social Science Research Council. Jessica's first book, Art for an Undivided Earth, The American Indian Movement Generation, published by Duke University Press in 2017, traces the impact of indigenous struggle for land and life on artists working internationally since the 1970s. Her second book in progress, which I am already looking forward to, is going to be entitled Earth Diplomacy, Indigenous American Art and Reciprocity, 1953 to 1973, which examines how artists revitalized indigenous cultures of diplomacy in the unlikely shape of Cold War tours, translating Native American approaches to political ecology across 2 decades and 5 continents. She joins us today from Newark. Welcome, Jessica.
Oh, and thank you so very much, David and Noy and other organizers of this event. I'm really looking forward to the work of my fellow panelists, and I'm grateful to all of you for supporting this really welcome invitation to share ideas across fields. I'm so humbled by the work that you're all doing that I've learned about during this past day of talks. So I'm speaking to you today from my home office in Philadelphia. And like the University of Delaware, where I teach, this situates me in Lenape-Hoking, homelands vital to the past, present, and future of Lenape. European colonizers and later the United States forced Lenape westward and northward, where they formed nations in present-day Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. And others never left or returned from exile when they could, and their continuing tribal communities steward the ecologies of this region today. This context, regionally, locally, is relevant to my scholarship, which sits at the intersection of art history, Indigenous studies, and environmental justice concerns. And I'm also sometimes an interloper in international relations, which is an interest that was born when I double majored in art history and political science many years ago at UC San Diego. Share my screen. So on screen is the title of my second book, which Dave has already introduced. And I have been in the bibliographic weeds trying to get the draft off to my publisher. So today has been a really welcome opportunity for me to step back and draw out of this work 3 big picture proposals for what I think art has to offer: a pluralized and sustainable theory and practice of diplomacy. And my proposals today will also double as priorities for the roles that art might play when it is either invited or otherwise inserted into both state-sponsored and unofficial spaces of diplomacy, such as those that so many of my other panelists and other speakers have already illuminated. So my first proposal: art can invite us, must invite us to reimagine the nature of our relationships to one another and the earth. This first priority concerns the future. We live on a devastated planet, a colonized earth, one in which indigenous and majority world land and bodies are continuously exploited to serve the accumulation of capital for an elite few. And our current system of international relations is indebted to European colonial expansion. Today, it's maintained by nation states invested in resource extraction in close alignment with multinational corporations. And this system in its sort of large scale has and is failing a majority of humans and the other than human beings and systems on which all life depends. In 1989, the Bulgarian-born US-based artist Christo created this maquette that you see on screen of the globe, shrink-wrapped in plastic like a commodity. This portrait of endangered Earth accompanied Time magazine's decision to award Person of the Year to the planet. And you'll see Africa looms large, bound with twine as if readied for global shipment. In the wake of congressional briefings on the emergent scientific consensus about climate change, Christo hands us a sold and suffocating planet. We must be able to be empowered to dream of alternatives to our current ecocidal course, to exercise imagination before undertaking persuasion. And art can provide, on the one hand, critical tools to assess the limits of our current world, but crucially, creative tools to dream and communicate a collective vision for a different future. Number two, art can support the survival and resurgence of alternative cosmopolitical traditions. This priority primarily concerns the past, although it spills, as we'll see. In my own work, I'm concerned with Indigenous political traditions that have been systematically excluded or exploited within a modern nation-state system. Before and during the colonization of the Americas, Native nations engaged in diplomacy, not only with one another, but with their more than human relatives. Material culture, art, was the medium through which Indigenous leaders negotiated their alliances with others, often across great differences and distances and differences of language and culture. Haudenosaunee people of the Northern Woodlands created political contracts made of shimmering whelk and clamshell beads. This is a contemporary replica of the Truro Wampum Belt, commemorating a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch from 1613. And it was created by contemporary Onondaga artist Anthony Gonyea for nation-to-nation treaties between the United States and American Indian nations, which is an ongoing award-winning exhibition that opened at the National Museum of the American Indian in 2014. It is a must-visit show for anyone interested in diplomacy. And this belt, you'll see, has two rows of purple shell representing two boats traveling down the same river. One is a canoe carrying Haudenosaunee people, laws, and spiritual practices. The other, a Dutch ship with their citizens, religion, and legal norms inside. The boats are meant to travel peacefully, side by side, and they embody the value of the Khasawnih, a diplomatic tradition based in respecting one another's differences, as well as, crucially, uplifting each nation's responsibility to maintain harmony and balance throughout the web of all life. Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people of the Plains, on the other hand, pass the pipe. I'm showing you Plains Nation's pipes and pipe bags, again from the Nation to Nation exhibition. By smoking during diplomatic encounters, dignitaries inhale the spirit, the breath that flows through the universe, animating and connecting all beings. Leaders thereby invite strangers into Mitakuye Oyashi, all our relations, an expansive system of kinship that includes mountains, rivers, plants, and animals. So the common goal of such diverse material traditions of diplomacy, and there are hundreds and hundreds more, was to facilitate long-term familial relationships governed by reciprocity with and responsibility to the earth itself. More than human ecologies were and are understood to be essential to sustaining human political relationships. And art in these cases is literally made of the bodies of Earth relatives, making them present at the negotiating table, right? We've seen works made of clamshell, deerskin, porcupine quills, and bird feathers so far. Beginning in the 17th century, gifts of peace medals accompanied paper treaties signed between indigenous nations, European colonial powers, and eventually the United States, such as the Jeffersonian Medal of 1801. And now we begin to run into wholly new forms of misunderstanding, coercion, and betrayal, as many of you will be aware. And with the advent of US westward expansion, treaties began to function as vehicles for stripping Native nations of their homelands. Modern nation states have colonized the spaces of diplomacy, as geographer Jason Dittmer and many others have observed. Still, the memories of indigenous cosmopolitical traditions of diplomacy persist, and they shape indigenous art and activism and political relationships in the 20th and 21st centuries, when most of my own research enters the picture in the second half of the 20th century. I'm showing you here a larger than life painting, you'll have to trust me, that was created by the Luiseño American artist Fritz Scholder in 1968. This oil painting foregrounds the figure of a Plains indigenous diplomat. A peace medal hangs around his neck. A befeathered ceremonial pipe is cradled in his arm, and a beaded tobacco bag is draped over his animal skin regalia. You'll see his back is turned to the rear end of a rhino and the acronym BIA, standing for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Scholder painted in the wake of post-war Indian termination policies, in which the United States resumed a process of canceling treaty responsibilities, appropriating native lands, and assimilating indigenous people into the mainstream of US capitalism. Scholder also painted on the eve of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which was formed in Minneapolis in 1968. And during AIM, activists also regularly passed the pipe to spiritually legitimize their radical political commitments. So just as an aside, diplomacy and activism are certainly not opposites, as the previous panel on urban diplomacy helpfully hinted. And that's something I'd love to talk more about. Where does art sort of sit in a trio of diplomacy and activism? But Scholder's image, to stay with the painting, is one of, on the one hand, diplomatic betrayal, right? We have the BIA, we have the failed relationship with the United States government, but it's also an image that weds indigenous memories of material diplomacy to the possibility of a sovereign resurgence of Native nations. And that brings me to my third and final proposal, that art can affect the sensory and emotional experiences of political actors with sometimes very significant effects. And this is a priority that concerns the past, present, and future, as we'll see. Artworks such as Scholder's Indian and Rhinoceros certainly activate cognition. They make us think, often critically, about the world that we inhabit. But they have other more subtle tools at their disposal. Works like this can make us feel things, experiences that originate in our bodies through our senses. We perceive objects in our environment because we have vision and hearing and touch, right? These amazing bodies. Feeling also names emotion, right? Artworks can create affective disturbances in our psyches. Feelings of sadness, frustration, guilt, joy, excitement, extremely sorely needed hope, right? The French philosopher Jacques Rancière spoke about art's relationship to politics as a matter of shifting the distribution of the sensible. Politics, diplomacy in our case, is more than a purely rational ideological discourse, of course, and many have spoken to this. It names relationships forged by real people who have dynamic physical and emotional experiences in specific environments. And Rancière observed that politics relies on often repeating embodied rituals. They are often highly scripted and can be very normative, but art can enter this scene and make it suddenly strange. Art can subtly shift the embodied experiences of political actors with the potential to change the course of politics. And I fully admit, as an art historian, this process is very hard to measure, right? It doesn't generate nice data points at all, but we still need a language to talk about it because I believe it is a real force in history. And this brings me finally to the elephant in the room, or in this case, to the rhinoceros in the library. Specifically, we're looking at a photograph of a scene in the American Library in Bucharest from 1972. Fritz Scholder, the painter, was commissioned by the US Information Agency to travel through Eastern Europe on a lecture tour that year. He accompanied an exhibition of his own paintings, and his tour was part of a broader global US cultural offensive to try to win over non-aligned nations such as Romania. Well, Romania was communist, but nations that were not formally aligned with the United States in the face of fierce competition from the Soviet Union. This is a framework that Joseph Nye has spoken about in terms of soft power. I'm sure that will be known to many in the audience. Scholder's painting looms over the heads of the men in suits. Romanian painter Constantin Piliuta and library director Robert Geis. And here we're looking at Geis introducing the exhibition. He specifically lauds art's possibilities for, I quote, strengthening the friendship between our two peoples. And by this, he means Americans and Romanians. But Scholder's painting has introduced the plains diplomat as a third term, one that interrupts the binary logic of Cold War statecraft to insert sovereign indigenous traditions of diplomacy into the scene. And likewise, the pachyderm points to still yet another term, the more than human relationships that were profoundly impacted by the Cold War. Scholder's rhino most closely resembles the Javan species, which is on the brink of extinction in Indonesia as I write. But in 1972, when this event happens, the species still roamed Vietnam in regions that were ravaged by the defoliant herbicide Agent Orange. Scholder painted as anti-war protests erupted around the world in 1968. And meanwhile, the United States relationships with the government of Romania was strained, to say the least. And we could talk much more about how Scholder's painting might have impacted the senses and emotions and thoughts of an audience that I know included ambassadors from both nation states and a delegation of the CIA. But I'd like to just close by inviting us to think about these possibilities in our own times and spaces today, as Scholder's diplomat faces out toward us, the unpredictable audiences of the artist's future, as if inviting a renewed indigenous pipe ritual and thus a new relationship to unfold. Thank you so much.
I do not know where to begin in all the ways I would like to thank you for that fantastic presentation. You've reminded me yet again that were I to have the opportunity to go back to being an undergrad for pure pleasure, there is no question I would be an art history major and I would be signing up for any class you were teaching. But you've brought together so many fantastic elements and so many questions that I hope that we can come back to when we get to the question period. So thank you so much for getting this panel started for us and bringing together art and diplomacy in such a very tangible, specific, and inspiring way. So now we are going to turn to our second presenter, and that is Hanan Toukan, who is a professor of Middle East Studies at Bard College, Berlin. Her research sits at the intersection of international politics, Middle East politics, post-colonial studies, visual cultures, and cultural studies. Prior to joining Bard College Berlin, Toukan was visiting assistant professor of Middle East Studies at Brown University and visiting professor of cultural studies of the Middle East at Bamberg University. She is the recipient of several research awards, including most recently the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for her current research project on migration and the visual politics of museums in Europe and the Middle East. Her book, The Politics of Art, Dissent, and Cultural Diplomacy in Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan, was published with Stanford University Press this year in 2021. Hanan joins us from Jordan via a presentation she has recorded for our conference. And so I want to welcome Hanan, and now let us hear from her.
So hello, everybody. I'd like to start today by thanking David Wellman, Reina Nomura, and the other organizers of this very timely initiative that they've undertaken to bring us all together to think through the potentials and pitfalls of cultural diplomacy and its relationship to the encroaching closures that the environmental catastrophes we're all living under are imposing on us. I'm very happy to be here and to be presenting today, and I apologize for not being with everyone in person or even on Zoom in real time. So to introduce myself, I'm Hanan Toukan, an associate professor of politics and Middle East studies at Wired College Berlin. My research and teaching focuses on the ways in which cultural institutions feature in our lives, how they shape our ways of thinking around art, and how culture production features and functions in our lives. Specifically, I look at the institutional dimensions of art practices and how they impact the ways in which publics, audiences, and spectators, etc., effectively and visually experience politics through art. At the moment, I'm working on a project on migration and museums in Europe and the Middle East. The research focuses on how the refugee, the migrant, the stateless, and the displaced descriptors produced by neoliberal capitalism's unequal distribution of resources have sharply contrasted with culture and art institutions' claims to be transcending political and economic barriers. I won't be getting into this now. Suffice to say that the direction I'm taking in this work emerged from a book I have recently published on the arts and the shaping of dissent by culture diplomacy initiatives in the Middle East, which I'll be talking to you about today. So before I get into some of the findings of the book, I want to share with you all the link to a short video art piece made by two Palestinian visual artists, which I believe will shed some light on what kind of aesthetical expressions of the entanglements that exist between the arts, ecology, and diplomacy exist, and that I have been researching. You don't have to watch the video now, as I will attempt to describe it here to you all, but I do encourage you to do so in your own time if you have around 4 minutes to spare. So this is the link. In Motionless Weight by Ramzi Hazboun and Dia Al-Azza, a blue free flowing bag that holds the book of the poem, The Butterfly's Burden in Arabic by the late Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish is discarded at the start of a 4-minute video. With this act begins a short journey that takes the viewer through the bustling, overcrowded, and polluted streets and rundown alleyways of post-Oslo peace process Ramallah in the Palestinian West Bank. Commencing the journey with a plastic bag flowing across a book kiosk, we are given a glimpse into the types of high and low translated Arabic popular literature on sale in a typical Ramallah street book kiosk, as well as the plastic waste, environmental degradation, and urban noise and pollution that came with the diplomatic efforts to manage Israel's occupation of Palestine through the construction of a supposed new capital in Ramallah of a future Palestinian state to be. I'll show you an image here of the blue plastic bag. The blue plastic bag's journey finishes at the memorial site and tomb of Palestine's poet of resistance, Mahmoud Darwish. Along the way, the bag lingers against the backdrop of eerie instrumental music in front of a now obsolete mural of Darwish, gazing at the scores of people going about their daily business without so much as a backward glance at the mural before them. As if prodding the camera to follow it, the flying plastic bag then gives us a glimpse of the city's consumerist culture by finally arriving at the city's municipal garbage dump, located very near, perhaps too near, to the Palestinian National Authority built El Birwe Park Mahmoud Darwish Museum. Here, the artists are making a clear statement on how art institutions are bound up with cultural diplomacy efforts to solve the so-called Palestine-Israel conflict in reference to Israel's occupation of Palestinian land and people. I should say that the artists are part of a generation often referred to as the post-Oslo generation. This generation of culture producers grew up witnessing the supposed construction of a new real estate-driven capital city in Ramallah that came with the Oslo peace process, while at the same time continuing to struggle against the carefully designed Israeli system of legalized, institutionalized, and normalized violent discriminatory rule over Palestinians. Hence their artistic engagement with the traumas of military occupation, wall building in their midst, environmental catastrophe, and disaster capitalism has been also organized, packaged, and funded by powerful and rich art and culture funding organizations. In my own book, titled The Politics of Art, Dissent and Cultural Diplomacy in Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan, I take as my main focus of analysis the steady stream of financial and technical support from North American and European funding organizations to local artists and local arts organizations that have been in place and operating within the larger rubrics of cultural diplomacy and international development since 9/11. By uncovering the political and social functions of transnationally connected and internationally funded arts organizations and initiatives, I show how the production of arts within these global frameworks can contribute to maintaining hegemonic structures, even as it is critiquing them. Cultural diplomacy factors into my work by providing a historical and contemporary framework through which to understand the structural foundations in place that enable the transnational movement of ideas and resistant cultural practice, and how they are therefore related to powerful hegemonic institutions. The historical precedent of cultural diplomacy initiatives in the 1950s and 1960s in the Middle East is necessary to grapple with, because while cultural diplomacy with its legacy of secrecy and covert operations funding the arts has disappeared off the radar, it has, and as I show in my work and in the book, continued to survive in different forms well into the 21st century. Today, all over the Middle East, you find established non-governmental infrastructures operating alongside the state that are supported and maintained by multilateral and bilateral development organizations, as well as other developmental international organizations like the Soros Foundation and the Ford Foundation have culture at the heart of their mission. Such funders have in the past 20 years explicitly supported revolutionary artworks, war trauma, and memory-related artwork, gender and sexuality-related works, and in recent years, environmentally focused art. And I employ these categories here in descriptions explicitly because such terms of reference often feature into the call for project for proposals put out by these funders to local civil society actors. Much ink has already been spilled on demonstrating how the NGOization of civil society in the global South has culminated in both the de-development of or depoliticization of activism and in civil society. Accordingly, the categorization of art into typologies of war and environmental related disaster, according to funders, has been blamed for being one of the ways in which artists and activists begin the process of having their work managed, organized, and prioritized by the discourses and frameworks set out by established culture and art institutions or cultural funding institutions and organizations. So even though I agree with the terms of this criticism leveled at cultural aid, so to speak, what is more useful for us here, for the purposes of this conference, is to think around the ways in which culture, the term culture, often gets flattened in discussions of cultural diplomacy. It is worthwhile thinking through what this flattening may imply, because it often obscures, what I propose is that it often obscures what relations of domination imbued within art practices with transnational links and institutional support may be encoding and enacting. Underpinned by Western notions of universality, there is an assumption that the term culture and the praxis of cultural diplomacy means the same thing in diverse contexts, and that different types of culture function in the same way. But the normative framework of an ideal cultural diplomacy and its assumed positive impacts, that is, seeing the role of artists as cultural ambassadors, activists, and now environmentalists serving as neutral platforms of exchange, overlooks the ways in which power relations may influence how we understand the role of culture as a means of anti-capitalist critique. Acknowledging the push to revitalize the role of cultural diplomacy in urgent matters like environmental degradation, as in this conference, for example, and the renewed attention being paid to the different forms of cultural diplomacy, I suggest we reinsert a more radical and intersectional approach to diplomacy, one that is located in the realities of the global South, and specifically by exposing the ways in which neoliberal capital accumulation and the politics of ecology, environmental activism, and post-colonial globalization are intertwined. This would mean, what I'm proposing would mean rejecting the tendency to highlight normative assumptions about the celebratory role of cultural production in international politics. It would insist instead on uncovering the complexity of empirical evidence and the instability of empirical facts on which normative theories relating to cultural diplomacy efforts are often uncritically dependent. How this is to be done under the rubric of cultural diplomacy to address urgent issues like environmental change. So here I'm talking about what language, what forms, what aesthetics, what theories, and what concepts is a radical process that needs to be lifted from its Western universalist assumptions about its inherent goodness. What I'm proposing will allow us to instead insert the praxis and theory of culture diplomacy into a paradigm that urges an exposure of the very system in place that celebrates eco-aesthetics in the gallery spaces of museums without addressing the fundamental equalities or inequalities on which art world institutions, like other powerful institutions, rest. So on this note, I'd like to end my brief intervention with a very short quote on climate change and the arts published in The Guardian in 2017 by John Akomfrah, the wonderful British filmmaker, artist, writer, and which I feel encompasses how climate inequalities and the fight for change in the domain of culture production can come to be seen as global in the true sense of the word, and not just in the universalist Western sense and experience of the term that we have tolerated so far. This is just to go back to the link of the video. So the quote that I'd like to end on is, climate change is not just a white European fixation, though it is often presented that way. When I stand on a street in Accra, I feel that it is a city that is literally at boiling point. It is way hotter than it was in the 1960s or even the 1990s, 1980s. We need to start looking at climate change in radically different ways, not just as part of a Western-based development initiative. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Although I am unfortunately unable to thank Hanan directly in this very moment, I just want to express my gratitude to her before everyone else here, because she was very kind to have recorded this for us, and she was very sorry not to be here in person. But I will convey our gratitude to her following this conference. So at this point, I would like now to move to our third panelist, and that is Hameed Khasawnih. He is the project manager of Über den Tellerand in Berlin, and a longtime advocate for migrant people in Europe. Über den Tellerand is a Berlin-based organization active in 25 cities in Germany that engages in the field of social inclusion by building bridges among immigrants and host communities through people working together side by side in the preparation and sharing of food. Hameed's academic background is in the field of development and economics. His previous professional engagement was as a project coordinator in the Jordan Red Crescent and Danish Red Cross, where he also coordinated the efforts of local groups of volunteers in Jordan and Palestine who engaged in the field of youth capacity building. Hameed joins us from Berlin. Welcome, Hameed.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, David, and thank you for the first two speakers. I'm quite overwhelmed by the quality of the talks given. Jessica, that was really, really great. And on a also a personal level, hearing Hanan talk from my home country, Jordan, and all this representation of indigenous struggles is really special. So from where I'm seeing, I'm really, really impressed and a bit intimidated as well. I don't have the eloquence of the academic writing and language. I am a social worker in a certain sense, and will be happy to share with you a bit about my experience and see how this can relate, or how we can look at it from the lens of diplomacy. So where I work is in an organization called Über in Tellerand. It is the German expression for outside of the box. But outside of the box in German, Tellerand is the rim of the plate, and Über den Tellerand means beyond the rim of the plate. So it's first of all a play on words to say that we have a concept or an idea that is outside of the box. At least that's what we hoped it would be. And it, including the word plate, is really working well because we work on the topic of food. So our organization started back in 2013 when a few students came. There was a really important squatting and political demonstration happening in quite a lefty important area in Berlin. And a lot of people who are asylum seekers and seeking migration were squatting that area. And what happened is that there was not a lot of room for dialogue, mainly because of language barrier. And what those bunch of students made is that they decided, let's go and cook with each other. And it was just a simple idea to just go and just create dialogue and get to know each other. And from there, they actually made the first cookbook that kind of documented the interactions, the recipes, the engagements, the people they met on that day or on that sequence of a few days. From there, that idea developed to come and think that there's a huge possibility here. And it also came as a cure, or as a way to deal with a fundamental critique with how this society, or a big part of civil society, has been supporting newcomers. A really important part of supporting newcomers or people who came here as refugees is supporting people of integration in the housing market, in the labor market, giving legal consultation, giving all sorts of the support that somebody who's coming here isolated, language barrier, traumatized, need. However, what this organization came with is the idea that there's an essential part of the so-called integration process, or this essential part to the social inclusion process. And that is, we need to meet beyond the helper-helpee dynamic. I need to meet you not in a place where I'm superior and you need me. I need to meet you, in German we say auf Augenhöhe all the time, which means on equal level or on eye level with two people. And the organization came with this concept, let's just meet on equal footing beyond that helper-helpee dynamic. And as a tool to do that was food, which was inspired through those few interactions that really created a whole set of really positive relationships and friendships back in 2013. So food in a certain sense is a language, or is a means of communication at least. And it's really, really rich. Food is a store of identity, is a store of our collective history, is a store of where I can share with somebody while I'm cooking something from my home country, grandma's recipe, or something about my home. So in a certain way, it is really a good way where I can share with you a lot about myself and know a lot about you. And in the same time, it's a way when we sit down with each other, even though we're not speaking the same language, it's an icebreaker event by itself, right? We're cooking with each other, we're handing each other the knife. The whole environment surrounding the cooking process is also interactive and plays as an icebreaker process. We do have, I try to think about the diplomacy in general, and I know from international relations and diplomacy that there's also this term, gastromediation. I think it's used mostly in international politics scenery when thinking about meeting between important politicians, and that usually there's a lot of thinking like should they sit and eat, what food should they eat, what is the power of food to actually bring different emotions, bring different psychological processes, and And as far as I understood, there's a lot of thinking that goes like, should we have this session of the conversation before lunch or after lunch, or all these different elements? And there's a lot of power in that, because food it really affects our physical, emotional, psychological status. We all know the term, or when we're incredibly angry because we're lacking food, or we're incredibly happy, or so its capacity to bring us together is really, really rich. And on another element, it's a really huge symbol. Like food offers a lot of power in the symbology, into the rituals of culture. I come from the Middle East. We all know 10 years ago, the Arab Spring, the symbol of the Egyptian revolution was called aish, which aish is bread. But the word bread in Arabic or in Egypt, aish means livelihood. So that essential ingredient represent livelihood and represent a revolutionary potential. And in a certain sense, each ritual or many foods that we have really represent something, from luck to gratitude, to bringing people together. So even when we do a lot of our activities, we try to play in the power of food. We try to make a cultural day that is about a certain culture and the way they eat, or we try to think about Asian and means of livelihood, and try to really engage into each other's collective history and through that power. The organization spread then, like it's now active in about 30 cities in Germany with it's all done by volunteers. And there's a few of us who are employees who are like coordinating, supporting, and giving like all the necessary instructions in certain way, or not instructions, or just the process. To link this to the environmental crisis issue, I think it's really interesting that there are two ways where our work is linked to environmental crisis, or we see direct links. The first one is through that we work essentially in the field of migration as an enterprise. We try to allow newcomers or people who are coming with social isolation the space to interact and belong to that society. And the link between migration and the environmental crisis is dawning to our consciousness, the interlink between those two issues. And by now the term climate refugees is not controversial anymore. And of course, what's not controversial is an understanding that even refugees that are coming because of war and conflict and so on, once we look at the context of these situations, we understand the role of the ecological footprint, the role of droughts, the role of hurricanes, and the role of generally climate change that is actually driving conflict, driving poverty, and so on and so forth. This is on one element. And on another element, food by itself is really linked to the environmental crisis. It's linked as a symptom that the way or the food that is available to us is really now being influenced through this process. But to a great degree, the way that we are making our food and where we're getting our food and how we're eating is one of the main drivers of ecological change or climate change or environmental crisis. And this, of course, is really now reflecting hugely at our work. I work in the grassroots civil society sector, and I think one thing incredible about this sector is that it's really democratized, it's really localized, which ends up that the enterprise or the agents at play always take the form of the actual individuals that are interacting in it, from the volunteers to the employees to the participants in our activities. And it's a democratized field, which makes it a human enterprise. And now with the genuine cultural shift that is going through the direction of sustainability, where each as individual of us is thinking how we eat, where do we get our food, and so on and so forth, this has been reflecting quite radically or quite visibly, let's say, in the field of our work. I'm not good at looking at the time, but I will keep going while somebody gives me a sign. I talked a bit about visibility, and there are certain things I can talk about that. So it is a bit beyond the arts where I'm taking the discussion, because of course food is an art and the way we're getting people together has an artistic form. But I talk also in a way that we are to represent this grassroots civil society. And I do not mean huge bureaucratic NGOs, which are completely different fields in the economy. And in a certain sense, the strategies that we're trying to understand is that this sector of the economy, which can be termed the social solidarity economy, is a sector that is really interacting with all of the crises that are happening on the grassroots level, whether it's the crisis of migration, whether the crisis of gentrification or environmental crisis, and like all the different, it's this sector where people are organizing themselves on a local level to meet the local needs and challenges at their own localities. And usually those are the needs and challenges that are not addressed by the public sector, which is always in a process of being reduced, getting smaller, and most definitely not being dealt with from the private sector. It is at the end of the day also a crisis of neoliberalism, where the private sector is taking a bigger piece of the pie. The public sector, in all the support that it can offer society, is also reducing. So you have the social solidarity economy, or this grassroots civil society organizing itself many times informally, but sometimes formally, to interact and deal with it. And for us, the strategies, the place to go is that there's a certain point where we need to gather political consciousness. And that is that we cannot be all engaging in our own direct field of work, dealing with the symptoms. Like, so organization, I take gentrification always as an example, because it's a big topic in Berlin, here where I live. But whether it's in gentrification, which means helping people who are getting homes to find a place, or us dealing with all sorts of different migration issues, whether it's integration in the labor market, or getting people together to create friendships and getting people out of their isolation, or all the different elements were. The thing is, we're all dealing with symptoms, and those symptoms are of a systemic collapse, including the environmental crisis. And there is that civil society that is engaging quite closely in the environmental crisis, and we interact a lot with them, from people working on sustainable gardening to sustainable means of farming. And as an organization that works with food, we're always also interacting and exchanging, because there is this informal network of how the civil society is also getting in touch and kind of exchanging and building a network. We are also even part of a network called the Social Gastronomy Movement, which is this international, now formalized way of exchange about all sorts of social enterprises that are dealing with the topic of food in all its different realms, which is great. But at a time of crisis, I understand this is to be our main thing that we need to address in this conference. This crisis is a systemic crisis, is a political crisis, and requires political solution. And at a time where we are not like a few decades ago, where there was trade unions and a genuine workers' movement that can build itself into a genuine political pressure and make genuine policy change. Of course, there's still a possibility, and we should go that path. But we know with neoliberalism and with globalization, there's always been a detachment from this process. Now, civil society is the force that needs to organize itself politically and gain that political consciousness and deal with all the symptoms or all the topics that they're dealing with in a systemic manner. And for that, we need to build a lot of, first of all, we need to be a bit not so overworked. The same dilemma existed with the workers' movement. But then second of all, we need to formalize and institutionalize the way we are working and understand that we need to build pressure. We need to act as social movements do. We need to actually interact with existing social movements. And we need to understand that the problem or the solution to our problems are also policy changes. So we cannot be just always working in that locality. And in that sense, we need to understand the emergency, how grave the moment is. We need to lead the force for democratization in society in a way that is reflected in how democratized this grassroots civil society is. And in a certain way, we need to be part of the cultural change that is happening in society, the cultural change that is led by the arts, the cultural change that is led by social movements. And I think here the power of Black Lives Matter, the power of, if we're talking about the environmental crisis, the power of Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, the power of movements that really bring things into our consciousness, to make us understand the way forward. And there is a lot of political potential and possibility where this grassroots civil society is going. I keep saying grassroots in order to differentiate that than the big NGO sector. And this is indeed already happening. And like one can incredibly see it, just as we see it in the arts, just as we see it in movements being built, that we are in a process of developing further. One question that we were asked to maybe address is, where does the diplomacy work on this element in the field of our working? And I would say here there are two ways to think about that. One is that this sector is not isolated. At the end of the day, it is completely dependent on the public sector and the private sector. First of all, dependent financially, which means also the framework of our work also has to be kind of defined already by our funders, which is usually either the government or private foundations. Here, diplomacy plays a big part. Like, we're all diplomatic agents, and what's really interesting that they have more the power to like set the framework. But what's interesting is that this grassroots sector, these social enterprises, are the ones that are genuinely on the ground. That is, they're the one that genuinely understand the needs. So in a certain thing, there needs to be a bigger part or a bigger share in decision-making power of where budgets would go, or where our funding should lead, and what kind of operative support this sector needs. And there are a lot of allies, both in the private foundations part and in the public sector. But of course, we're talking about huge bureaucracies. But here, diplomacy can really be a direct forward. Like, how can these three different sectors interact with each other in a collaborative, more organized process? And the second point where I think diplomacy needs to play a role, which I kind of mentioned, but I'll mention exactly, is within the civil society sector itself and the organization that can happen. And when we're talking about environmental crisis, we need to talk about transnational organization. And this is indeed happening. I think it needs to take a much bigger political form. I mentioned one interesting example that we are part of, although there are many examples, which is what was termed the social gastronomy movement. You can check it out. Actually, after tomorrow is World Food Day. The movement as a whole deals with the topic of food security. We're already having an action on Saturday, so in 2 days, in the occasion of World Food Day, where we as Über in Tellerand, as well as all sorts of members and active enterprises and individuals and the organizations, are going to go and, in the name of solidarity, in the name of contributing to world food security, cook on that day and donate food to vulnerable communities. The objective, which I think they will reach, is to hand over 1 million meals on Saturday. At the end, it's symbolic, but it shows a lot of power about transnational organization and a lot of power that we can organize actually around the goal. And this is also an SGM goal at the end. So it's also building upon another form of transnationalism that happened on governmental level. And it's utilizing the power of food and the power of the grassroots. You can check it out on Social Gastronomy Movement. The summit starts tomorrow. Tomorrow, there's already interesting talks, interesting discussions about the power of food, and anybody can register and be part of that. So this might be an interesting example about how diplomacy did actually create a tangible, institutionalized form in this process. There was one question, is that where should diplomacy take us now? And I answer this as a person who also engaged in social movements as well. I think at the end of the day, and I'm also inspired by the first two talks, at the end of the day, there is nothing short than system change, right? And where we are now is a crisis of neoliberalism. It is a systemic crisis. It is a market failure. The public sphere needs to take a bigger role, at which point the social sector has a role to play, has a role in democratizing, into empowering the public sphere. We are talking not about now market-based solutions to make change. We are talking about genuine regulation, mass investments, taxation. We're talking about the emergency, really understanding the stakes of our historical moment, and not as an enterprise, not as one sector. It is as a collective a problem as it can get, and it needs as much a collective solution that we can gather. And at the end of the day, where we're thinking about changing the way we eat, the way we travel, the way we think about our energy, the way we're producing, we need to massive changes in Germany in the way we're producing steel, chemicals, cement, cars, all. And for that, we cannot wait for neither market-based solutions nor of a private sector as individual diplomatic agents to make the change, nor can we expect that the social sector, that is the sector that I'm in, that is rising up to meet needs of the moment, will be able to meet those needs on certain localities. At the end of the day, this sector needs to organize. So I will end this with that. I hope I didn't take more time than. Please, David.
Well, Hameed, I just want to thank you so much for such a thoughtful and nuanced presentation. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Anna Suchak here at DePaul University, our chair of the Modern Language Department, who connected us with you, Hameed, and who is involved right now in starting a Better Plate program here at DePaul. And so we aspire to be a small satellite of what the marvelous work that you are doing in Berlin. And so thank you so much. I don't know if we've been having difficulty with the Q&A portal, but I have received a question via text, and I want to pose it to the group. And I would like to, if you would be so kind, Jessica, to be our first respondent, and then Hameed. It's a great question because I'm thinking about the fact that all of you have spoken directly or indirectly to the fact that art can be appropriated by others and used in ways and means and displayed in manner that does not at all cleave to the original intention of the artist. And so this question, I think, is quite good. It is, what do you believe are the best avenues to amplify the diplomatic acts of artists? And this question, I'm taking it to mean artists on their own terms. So Jessica, would you mind speaking to that for us?
Thanks so much, David. Thank you also, Hameed, for an incredibly inspiring set of thoughts and illumination of the incredible work that you're doing on the ground. I think, David, this is one of the reasons why the Cold War is sort of endlessly rich with lessons for today in my mind. And one of the reasons why I was drawn to go back there as a historian to think about the relationship between art and diplomacy and indigenous worlds. The use of Native American art by the US government through the Department of State and especially the US Information Agency after it was established in 1953 was entirely appropriative and propagandistic. And yet it was also, there's sort of maybe a way of looking at this like, oh, there's a unified ideology when we talk about propaganda, right? And the whole government and all of its various agents are sort of working together as a machine. Of course, anyone studying diplomacy knows that's not the case. It's a cacophony of actors and all kinds of slippery spaces and ways in which Native artists and artworks were chosen to ostensibly to represent the United States in the cultural offensive abroad. What really interests me the most, I'm actually fine with these kinds, well, how do I put it? These are deeply troubling appropriations, but they aren't the end of the story in terms of what art is capable of doing in these political spaces. So it created opportunities, often for artists to travel alongside their works and to function as, double agents, right? Who, on behalf of whom were artists of Native heritage working during the Cold War when their own tribal nations were being terminated by the federal government. Art has this potential to be a site of excess meaning where however appropriative and propagandistic the context may be, that is never the end of the story in terms of the potential impacts politically that art can have. And so, as problematic as the Cold War framework was in terms of the hegemonic appropriations of Native art, I think that it's an incredibly rich moment for thinking about how art slips around and past the particular agendas it's assigned in order to, in this case, keep alive the possibilities that there are whole, cosmopolitical traditions of diplomacy that are still alive and contained in artworks that might have additional excessive impacts on their global audiences. And I'll turn it over to Hameed.
Well, I just want to say to you, Jessica, thank you so much. And I was just going to say, I so wish that Hanan could be with us here today, because I first became aware of her work from an article she wrote on hip hop diplomacy and how the United States government was using hip hop artists to go around the world. And her conclusion was similar to your own, in that on one level, you could be critical in the sense that, the United States government was using artists, many artists of color, in fact, in ways, and as the jazz program before was used. And yet at the same time, it also gave artists agency and platforms and connectivities that they might not otherwise have had. And so it was this sort of tension between what in fact was the platform for an artist, and then the limitations that you so correctly point out. Hameed, would you like to take this question?
So I think generally the question is beyond the scope of my analysis about the arts, but I can also share my thought about it. So inspired by what Jessica mentioned, and also inspired by Hanan's presentation. I come from Jordan, and although I'm not Palestinian, 60% of Jordanians are originally of Palestinian origin who came as refugees in 1948 and 1967. And now I live in Berlin, and what I think, and reflecting on food and cultural appropriation. So, and I think Jessica, in your research, you probably also touch about that the indigenous try to affirm their resistance through existence, through saying that we are here, and this is by actually keeping their cultural story alive, keeping the traditions, the rituals, the music, and of course keeping the food. I'm not sure. I think barbecue originally came from indigenous culture and then was taken into, appropriated into an American tradition. I'm not sure about that. But what I think is really, really interesting is that struggle within the confines of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and how you have restaurants from both countries serving the same food, right? But it is the colonizer, or first of all, the colonized serving the food of where they come from, and then the colonizer in another restaurant serving the food that was appropriated as theirs. And it's really an interesting way how each are demanding or calling for the identity through showing, through the art of food, if you want to say, who they are, or like affirming their existence. And I think this can be seen in different spaces outside Israel and Palestine, where you have diaspora communities affirming through food and through a process of cultural appropriation and reappropriation their existence. So it's a really, really interesting debate within these issues. So I can add that from my side as linking food and where I come from and inspired by what I'm hearing.
Thank you so much, Hameed. I have received one more question, and it's a good follow-up to the first one. And that is, from what both of you have described with regards to artists' agency and expression. This question is, how might we best encourage other practitioners of diplomacy who are not artists to learn from what artists bring to the table in this work of bridge building? And Jessica, would you mind taking that question?
Yeah, thanks. I love that question. One of the reasons why I like to look early in my work at the many ways in which Indigenous material culture has functioned in trans-indigenous diplomacy, right, before and during the colonization of the Americas, is because it reminds us of like an entire world in which art was present everywhere, serving all kinds of possible roles, not relegated to a museum to hang on a wall so that it can be commoditized in a global art market, right? Where art is the medium of diplomacy, and where a wampum belt functions as a political contract, a binding political contract, right? Not an accessory to a paper treaty. I think that these indigenous contexts which persist and which continue to be activated, wampum belts continue to be, right, used and made for diplomatic reasons today, contains a lot of lessons for how art in all of its multisensory ways of addressing bodies and creating collectivities. I love the example of food, because feasting as well is a crucial part of indigenous diplomacy, because it connects bodies, and it connects bodies to the land in a really tangible way as the gifts of the earth are taken into the body and form these connectivities, right? So I think, you know, one of the lessons for the arts in that very broad lived way is, of course, that all of those same modalities, right? The attention to embodiment, attention to affect, attention to the way that bodies and objects connect us sensuously, can be part of the toolkit of diplomacy, and in fact is urgently needed and is happening anyway in diplomatic spaces. We might just not always be noticing all of that sort of all the things that are happening beneath and around cognition and impacting cognition in diplomatic spaces. That's a very rich toolkit.
Oh, yes, indeed it is. Well, thank you so much for that. And so, Hameed, would you like to speak to this question?
Sure. So I'll give us first one example before I address what I think the question is. So in Über in Tellerand, we made two major cookbooks along the way, and it can like also already show how we imagine the world anew. And the first cookbook was people who came to Germany as refugees in 2015, shared a recipe from their own homeland, and then it was some information about the person themselves. And the power of that was to try to address to the local population. So to say, who is this person behind that term refugee? And we used the food and the person's story to show that. In our second cookbook, a year later, the cookbook showed different kinds of recipes where chefs from Germany, star chefs, met people who came here as refugees and migrants, and through a sitting and one-day interaction, they created something new together. So it was a fusion cookbook with new recipes rather than old traditional recipes. And here it was showing the other side of the process, that we are here and we're creating something new together. You know, there's a fusion here that is happening through food, but is happening in society. And I think this is what art is trying to tell us at the end. Art is pushing the limits. It's the act of imagining the world anew. And to answer the question in this most simplest of form is to just follow, right? What can we learn from art in all the different fields? Is that once art pushes those boundaries and those limits of imagination, because we're all in those different sectors confined by the existing boundaries, but art offers first the space for imagination, and then we follow through with a tangible, genuine creative idea in all different fields and sectors. So on a simple form, it is the name of the organization is outside of the box, right? It's also trying to say we are pushing the boundaries, or we want to think of the world anew, and we want to think of social inclusion as a fusion between all of us.
Well, I cannot think of a more wonderful image to leave our conversation with this. I just want to say that Jeff Weissman, my colleague, and I were remarking between the panels today how much we wish that we could all go together and share a meal now in the same space. But although we are limited in this moment, you have brought such richness and joy and insight to this virtual space that we're all inhabiting. So I just want to give my most profound thanks to Jessica Horton in Philadelphia, Hanan Toukan in Jordan, and Hameed Khasawnih in Berlin. Thank you so much. And I want to also say, if the two of you are able to stay just a little bit when we finish, I would love to speak with you for a moment, if you're able. I would love now to call attention to the fact that we have finished our panels for today, and tomorrow we will begin again our third and final day of our conference at 9 a.m. Chicago time with a keynote address by Teresa Fajardo entitled Facing Ecological Challenges, the Future of Environmental Law. And she will be coming to us from Granada, Spain. That will be followed by two panels. Panel 6 entitled Indigenous Voices in Global Environmental Diplomacy, where we will be hearing from both First Nation and Native American panelists regarding their perspectives. And then our final panel is entitled Interconvictional Bridge Building as a Diplomatic Response to the Ecological Crisis. And there we will be joined from interconvictional bridge building practitioners in the United Kingdom and France. And so from Chicago, we want to wish you a wonderful rest of your day. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.